I think Luke has a wonderful way of capturing sort of the drama, the human drama of the story like this one. Luke's such a human gospel, worried about the inclusion of everyone, bringing them closer and closer to the inner circle of who Jesus is. In this story, we get lots of emotional reaction. We missed a little bit of it when they wondered about how the stone would be moved away. Then we hear that they're perplexed. We hear they're terrified. And then they remember. They go and tell. They're not believed. And the final word is amazed. But what strikes me about Luke's gospel is how prevalent unbelief is. How difficult it is to believe in the resurrection. How difficult it is to get our heads around Easter. Nobody greets the risen Lord on Easter morning and goes, "Oh yeah, that's what I expected." Sure. Nobody. Not one person. In Luke's gospel, the message of the angels isn't to give them a new message. The message of the angels is to call them to remember. And they do. And when they remember, it's as if they turn to joy. But those women who ran from the tomb had no luck with the men back home. The women came back from the tomb excited. They went to the tomb in despair. Nobody believed that it was going to be a risen body, no matter what Jesus had said. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to the tomb with all that amount of spices and oils that they had prepared in advance. A kind of primitive embalming, if you will. They wouldn't have wondered about the stone. They wouldn't have needed the help of the stone. They wouldn't have needed the spices and oils if they had understood that he was going to rise from the dead. The first flicker of Easter is remembrance. Remember what he said. Bookmark that, because I'm going to come back to it. Remember what he said. And it's in remembering that they find themselves again. They become energized. They return to the other followers, all the men who it's just like the men to sleep in. You know, my wife gets up early. She gets more done in an hour than I get done in a day. You know, she's ready to go, and I'm just now getting out of bed. And this is kind of the same experience. They come to the leaders of the church, these women who had gone to the tomb. And in Luke's gospel, it's quite a handful of women. It's not just a couple. It says all the rest of the women with them. The whole group of women, who these women from Galilee were actually a very large number, went to the tomb that morning. We get the names of some, and then it catch-22s and says all the rest of them went. And they come back, and they're excited in their chatter. And the gospel says that the men received their news as, what did it say? An idle tale. In other words, bull. They don't believe it. Leros is the Greek word for the phrase idle tale. In English, we form the word delirious from it. They didn't just not believe it. They thought the women were nuts. And I was at the cemetery this morning at 6 o'clock. And I have to tell you, I didn't really expect to see anybody that I knew that was dead in there rise. I didn't expect it because, you know, the dead, they're dead. Death, ironically, is one of the constant points of life, along with taxes. And I'm really not quite that sure about taxes. There's a kind of security to that, isn't there? That's for sure. That's settled. I mean, you're dead. That's a long time. Not going to much be changing that. We don't deal very well with the facts that every undertaker of the world could sign any letter at the end, eventually yours. We don't like that. We don't want to think about it. Woody Allen joked, of course, a lot about death. He says it's impossible to experience one's own death objectively and still carry a tune. I think that's true. Someone posted a sign in a nursing station on an obstetrics floor in a teaching hospital, and the sign read this: "Recent research shows that the first 5 minutes of life are very risky." And some cynic wrote underneath on the sign, a little tagging had gone on, penned these words: "The last 5 minutes aren't so hot either." Death, it's predictable. It's solid. It's secure. We know it's there. The radical claim of Easter is not the claim that Jesus is resuscitated, that he beats it, he gets out, he's furloughed. That's not it. It isn't that death is robbed, nor even that death will be robbed for us or our loved ones. No, don't get me wrong. Easter is indeed about the defeat of death. We heard in our lesson from 1 Corinthians that the last enemy to be destroyed and put under God's feet will be death itself. This is a down payment on that notice. By the way, death, have fun today, because it's going to be over. That's what Easter means to death. For sure, those of us who've come today with grief in our hearts, hearing that God overturns or destroys death in the resurrection, is a real tangible hope for us. That's worth the price of admission. Life, not death, has the final word. God, not the systems of the world's dominance, has the final word. The news is enough for Easter. But I don't think it's this claim that really is the radical claim of Christianity, though it is one, and it is one that we take great comfort from. For the claim of Easter defeating death still butts up a persistent reality that none of you, including me, are going to get out of this alive. And so it is just a little bit of hope. And for someone who seeks intellectual honesty, this claim alone about death's defeat sounds a little bit like we're soothing our own fears, some kind of anthologies, as if it was the name of the tune that we whistle in the dark to keep ourselves from coming unnerved. So I want to consider another angle on what this means, that the tomb was empty, that the body was not found, and that later they saw him and they became witnesses to the resurrection. I want you to consider something else radical about Christmas. If you're here from Christmas, thank you for coming again. From Easter. It's the smell of the lilies. I'm getting delirious from them. The truly radical nature of Easter, when we take apart just the idea about death, is something about life. It's the claim that God entered the stage of human history in order to create an entirely new reality into which we, as his followers, are to live. Get it? Put aside the death piece, that's for sure. The truly radical nature of the resurrection is the claim that God entered the stage of human history in order to create an entirely new reality in which we are to live. All new realities are frightening. And that's the first emotional reaction to the resurrection. It would have been my reaction in the cemetery this morning if the dead had been raised. Oh, it would have been terror. It might have later been joy, but I would have probably driven away madly before I came to that reality. You know what I mean. At a far more humane, far more normal level, you try to do something new, and you get resistance internally, trying to break an old habit, and man, that old one just raises his head. Try to quit smoking, and all you can see is cigarettes. If you've ever tried to change behaviors in a family, your role in the family, and you try not to play your role in your family, you will feel the fear of those in that family system who want you to reassume your role in the family. The resurrection is then a frightening new reality. As one preacher said, if the dead don't remain dead, what can you count on? I don't know. Indeed, Easter was more than they counted on. So Easter is not only providing an answer, the answer to the conundrum that all of us face in death. Easter is also telling us that there's a new way to live. If death doesn't have the final word, how will you live? I want you to think about it. If death isn't the final word, how does that change what you struggle with today? How does it change you and your fears? This was the convincing witness of the early church. After they got over their befuddlement and their fear and their astonishment and their amazement and their leros, delirium, they began to get something. They lived as if death didn't have a final, conclusive hold on their lives. And it was convincing. They were fearless in their serving. St. Paul would say, to live is Christ. To die is gain. That's a win-win. If I live, it's all good. If I die, even better. It's great. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And ultimately, we have hope. Clearly, the paradigm then for living for the Christian begins to shift on the axis, this epicenter, this moment in history when a dead man rose, a dead man named Jesus. We might ask what needs to come to an end then in Easter, before we ask the question of what needs to come to a new beginning. Jesus kind of said it this way. In a parable, he said, a seed, Barb's illustration of a sunflower seed, falls into the ground. What's the first thing it does? Rots. First act, death. And it must die in order, he said, for it to sprout. If it doesn't die, it hangs out and something comes along and eats it. Okay, I added that second part. But that's what would happen. But if it dies, it says, it produces a stem and leaves. And it grows and grows. And then for a sunflower, what a wonderful illustration. I grew sunflowers last year too. It was so exciting. I have some growing now. What a great boost for a gardener. Suddenly, out of the one seed, hundreds, thousands. One dies, thousands live. I had 4 seeds survive. I had bagfuls of sunflower seeds. I could have fed an entire baseball team with my sunflower seeds. Bags and bags of them. So what is it on this Easter morning that's keeping you from living? What is it that like a seed has to fall into the earth and first die? What has to come to an end? What stone has to be rolled away? What blockage in our life do we have to let go of in order for the miracle of resurrection to take place? What makes it difficult to believe that something new could happen? What makes it difficult for you to understand that new life is possible? Is it fear? Fear of death? Fear of failure? Fear of rejection? Fear of the unknown? Is it the certainty of things you cannot be certain of? I mean, you came in here this morning, yeah, that Easter story. Give me bunnies instead. Is it the certainty of things you cannot be certain of? Perhaps Easter needs to shake this point of view as well, as it did in the early church. They weren't looking at this. They weren't expecting it. The disciples, they didn't first believe in it. But eventually it says that all 11 of the remaining, and then an additional one, and then Paul and many, many others, including over 1 billion people today who will celebrate his resurrection. Hallelujah. There you go. Da, da, da. Thank you. Eleanor, you're on the ball there. Come on, kids. I said it. I put it in there for extra credit. Thank you. And they would come to believe not because people were taken out of this life to death. They came to believe because it showed them a new reinvigoration for living, a new way to live. They had a problem on their hands. Nobody had ever done this before. So sounds like the church, doesn't it? Nobody's ever done this before. I think maybe we should just leave it at that and go back to fishing. You know? You've sat in that council meeting, haven't you? Nobody's ever done that before. The Gospels are written because they faced a dilemma. What does it mean that the dead man rose? What does it mean? And then they had to go back and start looking at his life again. They had to understand what he was teaching them all along. Just like the angels told the women at the tomb, hey, remember? He told you about this. The whole stinking church did the same thing. Hey, remember? He said this. Hey, remember he taught that. Remember when he did this? What do you think that meant? And they began from that point to construct the Gospels. Those things that we read every Sunday, and I read again this morning, the story of Jesus. They wouldn't have been written down had this morning not happened, and the women would have been successful in their mission to anoint the body and put the stone back in place and grieve their dead martyr. We wouldn't have known much about his life other than the fact that some rebellion was squashed by the Romans, as we hear about others would-be messiahs who were killed. The difference in this story is that he rose. And again, it's good news for those of us, all of us who face death, that endless abyss is now endless joy. But more importantly, it's an invitation for you and I to join among those who testify and witness to the resurrection. We are here because somebody witnessed to the resurrection to us. Somebody showed us what it looked like. Somebody said, hey, look, this is what Jesus would do. And it worked. And we were impressed. And we followed it. And we thought the example was a good one. And so we began to put it in practice in our life, and we began to see how it worked. I mean, that whole seed into the ground thing worked, not just for seeds, but for Jesus. Maybe the rest of what he said is going to work. And the disciples then began to build their lives based on those things, and those things worked. And they were willing to live their lives and give their lives to the contention that he was risen from the dead. You know, we don't have any record anywhere, either in the church or beyond the church, of any of the initial disciples who survived, sans Judas, who recanted under torture that they had witnessed the resurrection. Not one of them. Not one of them said, oh, yeah, it was a hoax. Not one. And many of them perished brutally, as Jesus had. Christ was alive, and they devoted their lives to living out his message. And my friends, that's our task too. In our world, no one will be able to see the resurrection because you cannot buy it on your own. I tell you, I was at the graveyard this morning. They're still all there. And if you're basing it on the witness and the facts of those things, it's tilted against us until we look into each other's lives and the witness of his resurrection life comes to us from one another. You know who they were. You know who they were. The ones in whose lives you looked, and there you found him. There you saw that something new could happen, that there was a possibility of a new way of living. And perhaps for you, that was the springboard to looking into his life and how he lived it. Not just his death and his resurrection, but how he lived. And maybe the way in which he lived was confirmed by his death and resurrection. In his book, The Christian Way, Maxie Dunham tells an interesting story about the great Canadian photographer Joseph Karsh, According to Dunham, Karsh only took one portrait of a person's back ever in his career. Pablo Casals in a small French abbey in 1954. Karsh writes that he was setting up his equipment and Casals began to play Bach on his cello. Karsh was so enthralled by the music that he almost forgot why he was there. And he took the portrait of Casals with a little bald-faced, bald-headed man bending over his cello from behind, frozen in time against a stone wall of an abbey. A stark photograph, but gripping. To capture, he said, the loneliness of the truly great artists, the loneliness of exile. Years later, that portrait was hanging in a museum, Fine Arts in Boston, and another old, bald-headed man came day after day, and he stood staring at that one portrait. The curator of the museum eventually became aware of the presence of this man who came day after day and stared at that portrait. And finally, he couldn't take it. His curiosity got enough of him. He came up one day and tapped the man on the shoulder, and he asked why he was standing day after day at the same picture. And the old man, obviously irritated by the interruption, turned to the curator and said, "Shh, young man, can't you see I'm listening to the music?" Is he delirious? Or can he see? Somehow in the witness to the world in which we live, we need to present a picture of the living Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection, and his continuing presence with us. We need to present a picture that has authenticity, that is real and vibrant, so that, shh, can't you see that I'm listening to his music? In one of his writings, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel said these startling words: "There are no proofs for the existence of God, there are only witnesses." He's right. It's true the same for the resurrection. There are no proofs for the resurrection, there are only witnesses. And they're sitting in this room. Easter tells us that death does not have the final word. That's good enough news for me, but it goes on from there. It's great news if you have a loved one that you're grieving. It's good news for all of us who will face death. But Easter simply isn't about some kind of vague in the future idea of heaven. It's to inform us how we are to live today. It means, as it did for the early church, to look back at the life and ministry of Jesus and suppose what his words really meant for us. And so I want you to think for a second about some of the things that he taught. And if he was risen from the dead, and as we say he is God, perhaps what he said takes on a renewed and even greater importance. What are some of those things? What are the things that inform us? What's in the gospel, the teachings of Jesus? Are you drawing a blank? Maybe you should look again and remember. Remember how he embraced a surrendered and sacrificial life. Remember he said to love your enemies, to not take revenge, but to turn the other cheek, to forgive without ceasing. Share the best of who you are and what you have with those who cannot possibly reciprocate it. Don't worry about your life. Practice servanthood. It's the path to greatness. Protect yourself by all means from greed. Don't judge. Don't condemn. It's not your place. Humble yourself. It really works if you work it. As you look into the life of the risen Savior and study him, may we also hear the music of this solitary life. May we take on that music and live it. May the dance of our life resemble it. That we will see and believe that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. remember. 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 And live. Amen.